Hello everyone, and this is the first part of a tutorial series on using Webpack 2. Here on the homepage for Webpack, first off just explaining what this is. Webpack is a module bundler, and I think this picture here describes it fairly well. It is for developing web applications in a very modern way. We have all these files, JavaScript, handlebars, CSS, Sass, and each one of them declares their own dependencies on other files. What Webpack does is it parses all this, makes a dependency graph of what every other module depends on, and then compiles that to an optimized set of static assets. Now, Webpack itself is highly configurable, a lot of options, and a lot of beginners are really turned off by the complexity in it, but it really does not need that complicated. The core concepts of Webpack are very simple, and I want to show you how to use those using Webpack 2, which is the latest version. Currently in beta, there's a release candidate out right now, but very soon, though, the final version should be released of Webpack 2. So what I really like here is on the homepage, they actually give you the basics of how to make a very simple Webpack project. And I'm going to follow that there and show you actually how to implement that from scratch in a new project. So before I do that though, I want to just show off how you would make the same app here without Webpack. So I have here my editor, and for this I'm using Visual Studio Code. Really great for working on web apps, very fast, has a lot of great features in it, very simple too. Alright, so let's get started on this. So as we see here in this project, there's an app.js, there's a bar.js, so Webpack and Fig, but for now we're not going to have that because we're going to make this without Webpack, doing things the old-fashioned way. And we'll still need our HTML page as well. So let's get started on that. So let's add app.js, and let's add bar.js. And you know what? Actually, I want this to be a little bit more interesting. Actually, have the project do something. So let's call this instead say hello, because we want something more dynamic happening so we can actually see what's going on. And then lastly, let's add our index.html. Okay. Start off with app.js. So we're just going to write here a web app that just displays hello world to the console. Pretty simple, nothing really special about that at all. So we have two modules here, the app file and we have say hello. So app is just going to call a function called say hello. Pretty simple, right? And say hello is defined over here. So this is a dependency of app.js. So let's define that function. Call it say hello. And let's log to the console. Let's do that. All right. Let's save both those files there. So we have app.js, which is called say hello, which is defined here. So these two JavaScript files have a dependency on each other. Pretty simple there. Now we have our index.html, which is currently blank. So let's fill that up there and make a really, really basic one. HTML tag. Let's define our head tag, which for now will just be empty. I'm not going to put anything in there right now. Body. And let's throw our script in here. Now, if we're doing things the old-fashioned way, every JavaScript file needs to be declared with a script tag in your HTML. And what's important here is that you actually do them in the correct order. Now, because app.js depends on say hello.js, it needs to be after it because these files are parsed or read in order there. So let's put in our first one, source, and let's throw in say hello. And now let's add our next script. And the next one now is app, and that's one that we'll be executing afterwards. Okay. And then now let's close that all off there. So now we have our finished HTML file. We have our two JavaScript files. The last thing we need to do is actually run this in our browser and load it up. So for this, we need some form of HTTP server to run this with. And for this, I'm actually going to use a simple node project called Light Server, which just loads files from your local directory there. So we're going to use this for this project. All right, so in VS Code, I can open up my terminal. And first off, let's create our package.json. That's what declares dependencies, dev dependencies, and our npm scripts. And for this, I want to use Yarn as my package manager instead of npm. Some of you may be familiar with that. Here's a project picture here. I really suggest using this. It's a really great project. I'll have a link to this below. So assuming you have that already installed, let's do yarn init and then y to accept all the options there automatically. And that's done. And we have our package.json defined there. Pretty simple. Now let's add a new dev dependency, which is light server. Oh, my bad there, that's a typo. Double dash. Okay. And there, we now have that installed. So you can see here we have one dev dependency for light server. Let's add our scripts tags now. And let's call this run. Actually, no, my bad. Let's call that start. Okay. So let's see. Syntax to do this here. Really simple one. Let's do light server S sets the will serve the root project directory, and then on port, let's bind this to port 3000. Okay, that looks good there. All right, we should be good to go there. So now we can just start this using yarn start. Okay, servant stack directory. Okay, so index.html will be loaded when we load from port 3000 then. So I already have a tab open for that. All right, then if I refresh this page here, you see there's nothing because we just wrote to the console and not to the actual document. But if we look at our console and we look at it, we see hello world. So all worked there and looking good. So of course, this is an example of an extremely trivial application, not realistic at all for something that you would really see in a real life application, but it does show a few basic things. One, we're using multiple JavaScript files, which you can treat each one as its own module. So that's something that you would see a lot more in a larger project. You see many more files, hundreds, if not thousands of modules potentially. And right now we have to declare each one individually in our HTML file, and we also have to declare them in the correct order too, otherwise we could have a few problems there. So that's not a good thing to have there. That's something we definitely don't want. So using Webpack, we could, you could say concatenate, but really it's actually more complex than that. These files into a single JavaScript file. And actually the correct word would be bundle, because it handles dependencies in the correct way and makes sure that each file still respects its own module boundaries and territories. So let's go about now converting this to a Webpack project. And before we go there, what it says about Webpack earlier is that it makes a dependency graph and tracks that, and creates the bundle out of that dependency graph. And so this all means here is that the whole Webpack mantra is that every single file, which is also its own module, should explicitly declare its own dependencies. And you might see right now, well, we are declaring dependencies. The index.html declares dependencies on app.js and say hello. And I could see kind of the logic in that, but that's not fully correct because it's an indirect dependency. Yes, the HTML file has a dependency on the JavaScript, but it only has a dependency on really the app.js, as in the main file. It does not have a direct dependency to say hello. It is the app.js which has a dependency on say hello. So it is app that should declare a dependency on say hello, not the HTML file. And Webpack, once we introduce that to our project, will fix that so that that works correctly. So let's Control-C out of our server, and let's get going on adding Webpack to this. So we're going to add another dev dependency, in this case Webpack, and right now Webpack 2.0 is not out yet, so I'm just going to add beta to that so we can install the beta version of Webpack. Nice thing about using Yarn here is it's a lot faster than installing with the default npm client. That would have taken a lot longer otherwise. Alright, so that is now installed, and we have Webpack ready to go. So if we take a look here back at the Webpack page, you'll see the difference here on app and bar, in our case hello, or the say hello, is that we have these import and export declarations. So this is using ES6 module system. So this is a relatively new feature that came with ECMAScript 6, and unfortunately, not too many browsers implement this natively, but Webpack will parse and compile this to a form that browsers can understand, and bundle this all into a single file. So I will actually include a link that explains these ES6 declarations a bit more. I'll give a little cursory overview as we build this, but it's really useful the way it works. So let's go back to our app file. So we're calling this say hello function. So the first thing is we need to declare the dependency on the say hello file, and that's actually really easy to do. We can just import, name it from say hello. Pretty simple there. So what I did there was, you see the import, which is the first word in an import declaration, and then we're doing what's called a default import. That's when you just have the one word there and you're just naming a variable. If you're used to Node.js development or use common JS modules, this would be equivalent to just saying var say hello equal to require. Exact same thing as that, or at least close enough. So we have that, and that finishes up the app.js file. Now let's go to say hello. So we can't just have a function say hello. We actually need to declare the exports of this. So if you think about this, every module not just declares what it imports from other modules, it also explicitly declares what it exports. So what we're doing here is we're removing this ambiguous global scope that we had earlier. So as we saw here in app, we're importing the default import from say hello. So in say hello, let's create a default export. So here we just use export, and then we use default to declare this as the default export file. And so one rule here is you can only have one default export per file. And that's an important rule there. It will break if you have more than one default export. You can also have named exports. You can have as many as you want, as long as they have their own unique name for each named export from a module. But I won't be going over that in this tutorial here, but we'll go over that in later ones as we kind of expand on Webpack more. So last thing here is we have our Webpack config, all this part right here. And this is an extremely simple Webpack config. In fact, it's the simplest one that you can create. And I'll explain that as we make this here. So let's create this file, Webpack config.js. Very simple. So Webpack is a Node.js based system. And so we actually have to use common.js imports and exports when we're using Webpack. We can't, right as of now, use imports and exports like we might be used to, at least without some other build tools. So here we just use module exports, which this would kind of be the same thing as doing an export default, very similar to that. And now we export our configuration. So a Webpack configuration is just a single object with a number of keys on it that describe the way your project is laid out. So what you first need is you need an entry. So if we think about the dependency graph as, say, a tree, for example, we need a starting point, like a one starting point, and we build it out from there. So we need to declare a single module in which we start at, which is a JavaScript file. And for us, that will be entry, and then we define app.js. And that's our entry to a project. The next thing is it needs an output, as Webpack will bundle and build a single file. So we need to declare this output as well. And output has a number of options on it, but in this case, we're just going to use file name. And the file name is going to be bundle.js, and you can name whatever you want here, but this is an easy way to call it. And that there is about the simplest Webpack configuration that you can do. Very, very simple one. An entry and an output, that's the bare minimum configuration. And now a lot of people are turning away from Webpack because they've probably seen configurations that are very complex, that could be, several hundred lines long. And yeah, it's true that Webpack configurations can get very complex. That's for complicated projects, and the thing is, it's not that complicated to actually learn Webpack, but we're going to take everything here one step at a time. In each following video, I'll add a little bit more to this and show a little bit more features and things that you can do with Webpack and the use of these features and when you should use them. But bare minimum, just plain JavaScript, no other file types, no images, no extra modern JavaScript and these transpiling, TypeScript, CSS, none of that. Just plain JavaScript. This is what we need here: an entry, an output, and a file name in that. And that's about all you need there. So let's go back to our package.json and let's add a new script to this. And let's call this build. It's very simple to run a Webpack. The command is simply just Webpack, and that's it. The Webpack CLI command will look for your Webpack config.js. It will parse the entry file, build the module dependencies, and then compile that into a single file called bundle.js. The last thing we need to do here is go back to our index file and remove our scripts and now change to only a single one. Let's call this bundle, as that's a file that will be output by Webpack. Save that. And now let's yarn build. And there it's done. Went by very fast there. So what that did was it took our two files, say hello.js and app.js. In fact, the Webpack stats here will actually list out all of the modules I found. So I found two modules, module 0, module 1. Say hello being 70 bytes, app.js being 47 bytes, that they were built and emitted into bundle.js, which is now 2.98 kilobytes. Some useful information there that you might find important if you're watching some performance metrics. So let's check out bundle.js to see the compiled output. So the first thing here is you probably see a lot more code than we saw earlier. This is just the Webpack bootstrapping functions here. It just adds this to the top of every single bundle it outputs there. It's really not that much code at all. Like in the scope of a larger project, you only have to insert this once, and so it's not really a big deal. So don't really worry about it, like bloating up the size of your compile JavaScript, for example. And we see here, it actually labels each of your modules. We see module 0, which is, as we see down here, say hello, and then module 1, which is the app. So what we have here is we still see function say hello, just the way we wrote it. And then down here in 1, we see, where is it? The thing that calls say hello. Oh, you know what? It's actually right here. It got transpiled out in a kind of more interesting way. But you know what? You don't actually need to look at your bundle.js file. This is like compiled code. You know, when you compile a C++ or Java project, you don't look at the compiled output. You focus on the code that you wrote. And using source maps and tools, you'll continue to see the code that you wrote. So just think of this as a binary blob that's not really important in the grand scheme of everything. Okay, so now let's go back here. Let's start up our server and static dir, and let's refresh. And there we go. Hello world. Exact same thing, except now it's loading the bundle instead. But still saying hello world. Now, right now we are still using that light server that we had earlier. But the truth is we don't actually need that anymore, because Webpack actually has, I wouldn't say built in, but actually has a solution for this that we can use with a Webpack project that it's very simple to use. Because right now we're running the server and the build as two separate steps. It'd be nice if we could combine them. So Webpack has what's called a Webpack dev server that runs Webpack, reruns it on changes to your files, and it does it incrementally, so it's a lot faster on changes to it, and then host all of that on a lightweight server, which I believe actually uses an Express server internally. So let's add that, and it's Webpack dev server. And because it's part of Webpack 2, we have to add beta to it for now. Hopefully pretty soon Webpack 2 will be released and you don't need to add the @beta part anymore. Okay, and we no longer need light server anymore, so let's remove that part as well. Okay, there we go. So now we have our start command. Let's replace this now with Webpack dev server, and that's it. I mean, that's pretty basic, really easy to do there. Webpack dev server, when you run that, once again looks for Webpack config and runs that, but now it runs an incremental build process and hosts the result of that on a server. So let's run this now. Yarn start Webpack dev server. Okay, so now if you see here, the output looks quite a bit different. For one, there's a lot more modules in here. This is because the Webpack dev server in development mode adds a number of extra files to it to allow features like hot reloading and a few other kind of more complex Webpack features. Stuff we'll go over in later videos, but just note that your bundle does look quite a bit different now. It's like a lot bigger now, 246 kilobytes. But once again, that's only in development mode. The production build is a fraction the size of that. It doesn't include all these extra modules that we have in right now, so that will be gone later. But as you see, it is currently being hosted at localhost 8080, and that's something that we can change in configuration as well, but we'll just stick with the default for now. So let's go to our browser, and let's change our port to 8080. Okay, and we see here the output of hello world. Just change the logs there, get rid of the favicon stuff, and that works fine. Now, nice thing about this is that this is all one process. and we can actually edit the files pretty easily. Let's change this to hello Webpack, for example, and watch what happens when we save this. It rebuilds at one file, and because it's incremental, it goes by a lot faster. So this is really useful for very large projects. Webpack will only have to recompile that single file, so it'll be very fast to reload this. And then if we refresh the page, hello Webpack. So very simple, minimal configuration here for a Webpack project. So I showed you here how to make the simple web app in traditional methods without a module bundler, and then how to convert that to use Webpack. Future videos, I'll go over more features, start talking about using loaders, plugins, and a lot of other Webpack features, and eventually hope to move into some more kind of obscure and complicated things that I see a lot of people struggle with. Let me know what you think of this here. This is the first video in the series, and I plan on adding a lot more to this in the future. Thank you for watching.